That night, in the great hall of Copenhagen Palace, the flickering candlelight illuminated a scene that foreign ambassadors would never forget. King Christian VII, the king of all Denmark, sat on his throne, laughing heartily and using a knife to make small cuts on his arm, just to see the blood flow. He raised his bleeding arm high, forcing the entire court to applaud. Anyone who did not laugh along, anyone who did not applaud, risked being whipped or losing their position immediately. It was not an embellished anecdote. It was how the 17-year-old king entertained himself, turning blood and humiliation into a pastime in the palace. Christian VII was a terrible paradox. Absolute power in the hands of a broken mind. He often forced his courtiers to act as clowns for his amusement, sometimes forcing high-ranking nobles to kneel, bark like dogs, or crawl around the banquet table on all fours just to hear the king laugh. But when the laughter died down, all that remained was a deadly silence, an atmosphere thick with fear. In his private life, Christian VII indulged in unbridled debauchery. The palace was no longer the center of politics, but the most lavish brothel in Europe. He brought prostitutes and peddlers into his halls and subjected them to all-night parties of music, wine, and debauchery. One night, he dressed as a guard and led a retinue of guards around the city in search of more prostitutes, then dragged them all back to the palace, to the horror of his courtiers. Cruel and cruel, Christian also found joy in the suffering of others. He once ordered a severe beating for a guard who had entered a room without knocking. At other times, just to test the power of his power, he would release prisoners, then immediately order them recaptured and tortured, all just to watch the fear on their faces turn to despair. The Danish historian exclaimed, "It was no longer a king, but a naughty child given a deadly weapon." But behind the madness and debauchery was a twisted mind. Christian had shown signs of mental illness from an early age, self-harm, delusions, and occasional panic attacks. Some historians believe he suffered from schizophrenia, others from a histrionic personality disorder. Either way, his instability, combined with his throne and unlimited power, made him a disaster for the kingdom. This is the key point that makes Christian VII one of the most haunting kings in history. Personal madness becomes collective tragedy. When wearing the mantle of kingship, the Danes did not know what tomorrow would bring. Today, the king might throw a party, hand out money, and laugh loudly. Tomorrow, he might throw a tantrum, demanding the execution of anyone who caught his eye. And in that gilded palace, all laughter was forced, all applause was shaky, because to be one beat too late could mean death. And it was there, in the stifling atmosphere of wine, blood, and lies, that the chilling question rang out. Was Christian VII just a pitiful madman, or a devil in royal robes? The courtiers once wrote a haunting sentence. To the king, the whole kingdom is no different from an orchestra. He is the conductor, able to make laughter or tears ring out at any time. Christian VII found pleasure not only in the flesh, but also in controlling the emotions of others. The all-night parties at the palace, where prostitutes sat at tables with nobles, were not just a debauchery. It was a test. He wanted to see who was good enough to fake laughter, who showed disgust. And in that moment, Christian enjoyed the feeling of winning. Modern psychology might call this power lust, the pleasure derived from the powerlessness of others. Some historians have even compared him to the Roman Caligula. They shared a passion for bringing the elite to their knees, turning court rituals into circuses. The more frightening truth, Christian VII was never completely unconscious. In many moments, he knew exactly what he was doing, but he chose to push himself further because each time he crossed a moral line, he felt truly king. As a teenager, the throne was too big, but pleasure gave him the illusion of being in control. Political analysts have pointed out that it was these sick pleasures that created the conditions for courtiers to manipulate. While the king was absorbed in lust, others took control of the government. Christian thought he was in control of the palace, but in reality, he was just a puppet in a yellow cloak, with others pulling the strings in the dark. The point here is, Christian's lust is not simply an individual instinct. It is the inevitable consequence of an absolute power structure. When all legal and religious limits are gone, the only pleasure left is to trample on moral boundaries. And when lust is given the power to rule, the entire kingdom becomes a group, sex game, with the people playing only two roles, unwilling spectators or victims. Amidst this tragedy, there is a glimmer of light. Queen Caroline Matilda, abandoned and publicly humiliated by her husband, she sought out Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Their illicit love affair was not simply a natural reaction of the heart, but an act of rebellion against the debauchery of the court. But while it was a liberating experience, it also sowed the seeds of an unprecedented political storm. And at the center of it all, Christian VII was still immersed in the illusion that he was invulnerable. Little did he know that his own lust would become the sharp knife that would cut into his throne. The chilling question arises: when a nation is ruled by pleasure, who is really in power? At a lavish banquet at Christiansborg Palace, where red wine was flowing and the orchestra was playing beautiful Italian music, Christian VII suddenly changed the mood. He stood up, eyes blazing, and ordered whips to be brought. And then he singled out an elderly nobleman, simply because he happened to look down while the king was speaking. To the astonishment of the entire hall, the whip swung, blood staining the noble robes in the middle of the banquet table. Christian burst out laughing, then raised his glass to celebrate as if it were an entertainment. Whoever did not laugh along, whoever did not clap, understood that tomorrow might be their turn. That moment reveals a stark truth. For Christian, violence is more than just an impulse. It is a ritual of power. He used violence as an artist uses an instrument. A crack of the whip, a smile, a nod, all had a purpose. Christian wanted to send a clear message. The throne needed no laws, only fear. And this fear is more terrifying than any law. Why? Because it has no rules. Today he pardons a murderer. Tomorrow he beats a nobleman for a mere glance. It is the unpredictability that paralyzes the court. It is called casual terror. When people do not know when they will commit a crime, they live in constant fear, and that fear becomes a more powerful tool of governance than any army. Christian did more terrible things. Once, he ordered a prisoner, released in the middle of the hall. The man burst into tears, thinking he was going to live. But a few minutes later, as he approached the door, Christian waved his hand. The soldiers immediately put the rope back around his neck. The glimmer of hope was crushed with a single gesture. This is the essence of the game. You don't need to kill many. You just need to teach people that their lives are in your hands and can be taken away at any time. Imagine the psychological impact. When one person witnesses it, they remember it forever. Then they tell others, and fear spreads. Gradually, the whole court, the whole country learns a lesson. The most dangerous thing is not death, but the fact that you never know when it will come. That is the sophistication of Christian VII's violence. It does not only hurt the body, it breaks the spirit. And once the spirit is broken, a man becomes a docile tool. Knowing when to clap, when to laugh, when to stoop low enough to keep alive. But just when Christian believed himself to be invulnerable, that whips and blood were enough to bind the entire court, another crack appeared. In the darkness of the palace, there was a silent observer, Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's personal physician. Struensee understood well. A court ruled by fear would soon seek to rebel, and the first to recognize this opportunity was not the nobles, not the commoners, but himself, the one who had the closest access to Christian's fractured mind. The king thought he was in control, but the truth was, the throne was already shaking, and the puppet master was about to appear from where no one expected. In a fit of rage at his palace, Christian VII drew a knife and slashed his own arm in front of his courtiers. The blood did not frighten him. It made him laugh like a child who had found a toy. It was not simply the bizarre behavior of a grown, king. It was the echo of a distorted childhood. To understand how Christian became the crowned beast, we must go back to his childhood as a young prince. Christian's childhood was not a warm one. His father, Frederick VII, was addicted to alcohol. His mother, Louise of England, died young. The child grew up in the Copenhagen palace amid cold ritual and harsh supervision. Instead of love, he received whips and lessons in discipline. The servant recounted, young Christian was often locked alone in a dark room for hours on end for discipline training. He screamed, he cried, but his cries only echoed off the stone walls. A child left alone with fear, sooner or later learns to turn fear into a game. When he laughs at the pain of others, it is actually the laughter of the child who was once abandoned, now taking revenge on the whole world. Modern psychoanalysis suggests that Christian suffered from a personality disorder and symptoms of schizophrenia, but no academic term is needed to understand. A child deprived of love seeks a sense of survival by inflicting pain on others. Because if they are in pain, it means that he still has power. Christian VII's lewd and violent behavior was therefore not just a sick hobby, it was a defense mechanism. He needed to prove to himself that he was still in control, that he was no longer the boy who had been locked in the dark. Power was not a responsibility for him, but a painkiller. That was why Christian trusted no one. Courtiers could be traitors, nobles could be threats. He was suspicious of everyone, even those closest to him. And in his suspicion, he chose the most extreme path, to torture before being betrayed. If everyone was a potential enemy, the surest way to safety was to victimize them before they could strike. Ironically, this very mentality made the court increasingly alienated and despised him. The more Christian used whips and pleasures to assert his power, the more real power fell into the hands of others. The king sat on the throne, but the court began to listen to another name, Struensee. Here the core tragedy is revealed. Christian VII was both perpetrator and victim. He was a perpetrator of fear, debauchery, and violence, but he was also a victim of a loveless childhood, of a system that only knew how to use the whip to discipline. If power had not fallen into the hands of a warped mind, would history have written him as a bloodthirsty madman, or just another pitiful prince in hundreds of courtly tales? One thing is certain, childhood had marked him forever, and that mark did not disappear when he was crowned. It was only magnified, sharpened, more terrible. Christian VII did not simply act like a mad king. He acted like a child locked in darkness, but this time he had a kingdom trembling with him. And while the king was haunted, Struensee got closer and closer. No one knew that Christian's vulnerability would become the golden key for someone else to open the door to power. The chilling question arises, if a king cannot rule himself, then who is really ruling the country? One winter morning in 1770, Copenhagen was abuzz with royal rites. Church bells rang, guards lined up, flags fluttered on the roof of Christiansborg Palace. It was like a fairy tale, a mighty dynasty, a young and powerful king. But behind the golden paint, the truth was cold and terrifying. Christian VII was just a mannequin placed on a throne, with the real ruler standing behind him. Outwardly, the ceremony was still complete. The king wore a royal robe, a crown, and held a scepter. The mandarins knelt down and shouted, "Long live the emperor!" But in their eyes, there was no longer respect, only fear and contempt. They knew very well the decisions written on the decree did not come from the king's mind, but from the pen of Johann Friedrich Struensee. Struensee, the German foreign doctor who had originally come to treat Christian, had now transformed himself into a shadow of true power. He understood the king's mental illness and used it as a key. Whenever Christian had a fit, Struensee appeared with a gentle voice and a comforting hand. And then, step by step, he penetrated the palace, seizing power through the king's weakness. The irony is, the people out there still think they have a king. The coronations, the pomp, Everything goes on as usual. The image is intact, but the substance is rotten. Christian sits on the throne, but he no longer rules. He only signs the documents that Struensee has prepared. He only reads the words that have been written for him. And when he smiles in public, it is a smile that is programmed like a mask. This is the power and the tragedy of the symbol. A throne may be empty, but as long as the ritual is maintained, the people still believe. The palace still lights up, the robe still scarlet, the crown still glitters, and so the society continues to bow. The symbol has become a collective lie. Everyone knows it is empty, but no one dares to break the illusion. Imagine this: a king is hailed by trumpets and drums, but behind him, as soon as the doors close, he trembles, cowers, and does not dare to face himself. The throne is no longer power, but a stage. And Christian VII is just an unwilling actor in the play that Struensee wrote. Struensee even used the king's image to carry out reforms. He signed major decrees in Christian's name, abolishing torture, expanding freedom of the press, and reforming finances. People thought it was the work of the enlightened king. But in truth, Christian had no idea what he was issuing. He was just a pen signing for someone else. So the question is, should the people be grateful to the sick king sitting on the throne, or the foreign doctor pulling the strings behind his back? The symbol of Christian VII's power, therefore, was not real strength, but a gilded lie. Behind the magnificent ceremonies, the whole kingdom was controlled by a foreigner, and the king existed only as a mask. But there is a fatal paradox. Symbols can sustain fear, but they can also easily collapse when the truth is revealed. And when the court discovers that Struensee has not only manipulated the court, but also stolen the heart of Queen Caroline Matilda, the illusion begins to crack. Christian VII thought he was sitting on a throne for eternity. But in reality, the throne had turned into a puppet chair, and the strings were tightly wound around him. The chilling question arises: when the symbol shatters, will anyone be afraid enough to bow their heads? In the summer of 1771, Copenhagen was ablaze with unprecedentedly lavish festivities. Flags flew high in the streets, and people were given free cakes and beer. At the palace, Christian VII, dressed in his royal robes, appeared on the balcony. With rare confidence, he raised his hand in greeting, and the square echoed with thunderous shouts. "Long live the emperor!" In that moment, Christian believed he had conquered everything. The cheers, he thought, were proof that his throne was secure, that his people still loved him. He threw his head back and laughed, as if the kingdom had never been greater. But the irony is, everything he saw was an illusion. Free cakes, free beer, all ordered by Struensee. Reforms that brought freedom, reduced taxes, banned torture, all were signed by Struensee in the king's name. Even the speech that Christian read to the crowd that day, word for word, sentence for sentence, was prepared by Struensee. The king was only a loudspeaker reading out a text that he himself did not fully understand. While Christian revelled in the cheers, the harsh truth was, he was no longer in power. His courtiers called it the nameless regency, a foreign. Doctor became the shadow prime minister, and the king was just a mask to hide the reality. But for Christian, that cheer was opium. All his life he had been haunted by loneliness, neglected since childhood, despised by the nobility. Now, for the first time, he felt celebrated, loved. Even though that love was built with money and tricks, it still fascinated him. He believed in it, because if he didn't believe, he would have nothing left. This is the tragedy of those who are at the pinnacle of power but have no foundation. They cannot distinguish between truth and lies. Christian VII thought the cheers belonged to him, but they actually belonged to the hands pulling the strings behind the scenes. He thought he was at the top, but in reality, he was sitting on the most precarious chair in Europe. The summit was not just Christian's illusion, it was a collective illusion. The people thought they had an enlightened king, ushering in a new era. The nobles thought they were still in control of the throne. Christian believed the party would never end. But in the shadows, another truth was brewing. All eyes were on Struensee and Queen Caroline Matilda. Rumours leaked out. The doctor and the queen were having an affair. While Christian danced on the stage of false power, in the harem, his wife was in the arms of another. And that was the first stab in the wall of illusion. Ironically, Christian himself did not know it. He was drunk on victory, believing himself to be invulnerable. But history has proven that the pinnacle of glory is often the moment closest to the abyss. The chilling question arises: a king who does not rule, a hollow symbol. How long can it stand before the truth is revealed? January 1772. The Copenhagen Palace is no longer a place of parties and music. In the pitch-black darkness, a coup d'etat is carried out with just a few nods. Struensee, the real power, thought he had conquered the whole court. He had the king in his hands, the queen in his heart, and power in his pen. But he forgot one thing. When the power of a foreigner and a young queen became too obvious, the Danish nobility would never accept it. That night, the royal guards were suddenly ordered to arrest Struensee. Queen Caroline Matilda was also dragged from her bed, her face pale and unpainted. Neither of them understood what was happening until they heard the news. The nobles had turned the tables. Where was Christian VII in all this? In his room, trembling as he signed the arrest warrant. He did not protest, did not defend the man who had manipulated him, nor the wife who had betrayed him. He simply did what was most familiar to him. He signed the paper. And with a trembling stroke of the pen, he ended the greatest illusion of his life. On the day of Struensee's execution, Copenhagen's square was packed. The doctor, who had once controlled the kingdom and embraced the queen, was now kneeling under the guillotine. The people cheered, not because of justice, but because they needed to see blood. The symbol of the foreign usurper had to be torn to pieces so that the throne could regain some dignity. Caroline Matilda was exiled to Hanover, where she lived the rest of her life in disgrace. The young queen, once a rare ray of light in a dark court, was now a shadow of history. And Christian VII. He remained on the throne, but without any real power. The nobles set up a regency council, using the king as a puppet to sign documents and issue decrees. The man who had been at the center of every power game was now reduced to a harmless pawn, living as if he were dead. This is the cruelest reversal in history. A king who once spread fear with whips and blood now becomes the most feared. He no longer trusts anyone, nor dares to oppose anyone. From a man who dared to turn the court into a brothel, violence into a ritual, Christian turns into a shadow lurking behind velvet curtains, trembling before every decision. The analysis here is clear. Power is never empty. When Christian let his lust and madness control him, power immediately fell into the hands of Struensee. And when Struensee overstepped his bounds, power returned to the nobility. Only Christian, the crowned one, never truly held power. His peak of glory was shattered overnight. The cheers he had once revelled in were reduced to cheers at the loss of Struensee's head. And if Christian had learned anything from it all, it was that a throne could turn men into monsters, or monsters into farces. As dusk fell over the square, Struensee's blood soaked into the stone floor, and the crowd dispersed. Only Christian VII sat in the dark room, alone with his hallucinations, not knowing whether he was a king, a puppet, or a child still trapped in the darkness as before. The haunting question arises: is the fall really the loss of the throne, or the loss of oneself long before that? After the coup of 1772, Christian VII remained on the throne, but a shadow of himself. For nearly 4 decades he existed as a living dead king. Edicts continued to be issued in his name, but they were drawn up by the Council of Nobles. Ceremonies were still held, the crown was still placed on his head, but everyone knew the king had no more power, nor any more wisdom. He often wandered the palace, muttering nonsense, or suddenly bursting into laughter while the court stood still, heads bowed. Christian VII died in 1808. The funeral was still solemn, the bells still rang, the procession still marched. But in the hearts of his people, he was not remembered as a wise king, nor as a great tyrant. He was remembered as a curse made flesh. When power falls into the hands of a twisted mind, a kingdom pays the price. His legacy was not a work, not a victory, but a haunting memory. The Danes later called that period the reign of fear and illusion. A reign where violence was elevated to ritual, lust became the unwritten law, and the throne was nothing more than a stage for tear-jerking drama. But from this tragedy, history leaves us a profound lesson. Symbols can lie, cheers can be bought with cakes, and a shiny crown can still hide a broken soul. The ultimate question for us is not only, who was Christian VII, madman, victim, or monster? But also, are we worshipping other hollow icons today, simply because they are gilded and celebrated? If you find this story opens up hidden corners that few people dare to tell, let me know by clicking subscribe. Because there are many other powerful ghosts in history, kings, popes, queens, nobles, that history books have buried under layers of silk. Together, we will dig up, illuminate, and expose those secrets. Click subscribe now so you don't miss any of the dark stories that history wants you to forget.